What's up, meta nerds? In this complete breakdown of what I and many argue is the first science fiction novel, but of course also a horror classic, we'll be going chapter by chapter, pulling important quotes, and when I think it adds to the story, giving extra context or to stress the deeper moral lessons. Sometimes they are very clear, but there are a ton of great subtleties worked in by the author Mary Shelley. Now, I did put timestamps down in the description if you want to jump ahead to the chapters, but I think understanding this background really does make for such a deeper understanding of this story. So first, I just want to briefly cover the famous story of the creation of this classic, then the deeper religious and philosophical ideas.
Oh, it's alive! It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
And how I think it's ironic that the creature has been butchered in pop media. It's just called Frankenstein. He really has been stripped of all the interesting and challenging aspects of his character. He's just a big, dumb, green guy. But to be fair, Shelley herself has done something similar to Aeschylus, by framing Victor as the modern Prometheus. It's also funny to keep in mind that her husband Percy Shelley was writing Prometheus Unbound right after she finished Frankenstein, so there was a real Promethean struggle in that household. Let's start with understanding the author herself. Mary Godwin, later Mary Shelley, was born into one of the most intellectually radical households of late 18th century England. Her father, William Godwin, was a political philosopher and early anarchist whose 1793 work, An Inquiry Concerning Political Justice, argued that reason, not divine revelation or government authority, should guide human conduct. He believed that humanity was capable of moral and social perfectibility through education and rational thought, rejecting all organized religion as a tool of oppression. While her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, was also a revolutionary, famously the author of A Vindication of the Rights of Women, published in 1792, a foundational feminist text that demanded women be educated as rational beings, not confined to sentimental or domestic roles. And this is over 100 years before women would gain the right to vote in the UK, which was 1918, and 1920 in the United States. Wollstonecraft combined Enlightenment ideals of reason and virtue with the deep moral concerns that still drew on Christian ethical tradition, though she distrusted institutional faith. Together, Godwin and Wollstonecraft envisioned a world shaped by justice, equality, and human improvement, but coming from people's own intellect, rather than having to work with the framework of a religion. Their daughter grew up in this Enlightenment milieu. Then in 1816, Mary Godwin and her soon-to-be husband, the poet Percy Shelley, and her stepsister Claire Clairmont traveled to Lake Geneva in Switzerland. They were staying at the Villa Diodati, near the famous poet Lord Byron. This summer was unusually cold and stormy due to a volcanic eruption the previous year, which caused severe climate disruptions, now known as the winter without a summer. Confined indoors due to the bad weather, the group of writers and intellectuals passed their time discussing literature, philosophy, and the supernatural. Lord Byron is the one that proposed the challenge to each of them. They were to write a ghost story. While Lord Byron and Percy Shelley quickly took up this challenge, Mary, who was just 18 years old at this time, struggled to come up with anything interesting. For days she had no ideas, and she felt great pressure to match the talents of Byron and her future husband, who by this time were already some of the most established poets of the era. The group spent their evenings discussing dark and philosophical topics like the nature of life, death, and scientific discoveries of their time. One particular discussion involved the possibility of reanimating a dead body through electricity, a theme influenced by the experiments of scientists like Luigi Galvani. One night, after another evening of philosophical discussions, Mary had a vivid, waking dream. She later described it in her introduction to the 1831 edition of Frankenstein. Quote, "I saw, with shut eyes, but acute mental vision. I saw the pale student of unhallowed arts kneeling beside the thing he had put together. I saw the hideous phantasm of a man stretched out, and then, on the working of some powerful engine, show signs of life, and stir with an uneasy, half-vital motion. The vision of a man-made creature brought to life by its creator would become the foundation of Frankenstein. And as soon as she awoke from this dream, she immediately went to work writing. Keep this in mind when Victor, and perhaps those in modern emergent technologies, also seem to be hit with these sources of inspiration that don't come from their own conscious waking thoughts. Shelley will play with the idea of this spirit of innovation being something outside of the individual. But what began as a short story to contribute to this ghost story challenge soon expanded into a full-length novel. She worked on it over the next 2 years, with Percy Shelley offering some editorial suggestions and encouragement. By 1817, the novel was complete, and why it feels so authentic and timeless is that it's pulling on the most ancient of mythological themes, the most advanced science of its day, the greatest works of literature, but crucially, also her own life. Her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, had died shortly after giving birth to her, and Mary herself had already experienced the death of her own infant daughter by this time. And by the time of the 1831 revisions, she would have lost even more children. One of the great critiques of Victor, and perhaps our own species, depending on if or how we handle the emergence of AI intelligence, is how Victor goes through all this work to imbue life in this creation, but is horrified once it's completed and abandons it. As a mother suffering loss, at a time when she is surrounded by people with an optimistic vision of the future, who don't really seem cautious at all in dismantling these older systems like religion or monarchies, and seem to be pursuing science for its own sake, without being frightened of where it might lead. Frankenstein or the Modern Prometheus would be published anonymously in 1818, when Mary Shelley was just 20 years old. Many readers at the time assumed that Percy Shelley was the author, given his established reputation, the Promethean themes, and the preface signed in his name. Mary was only revealed as the author in the 1823 edition, though funny enough, that is the version thought to have seen the most editing or input by Percy. But of course, still the consensus is that while she was affected by those around her, like all creatives, this is thoroughly, unquestionably a Mary Shelley creation. The novel was initially received with a mix of fascination and horror, while also being a profound philosophical exploration of man's ambitions and the dangers of overreaching in science. This is why it's considered a sci-fi novel, playing with the science of its time and seeing where it could lead, but not just in some tech journal way. To be great sci-fi, you need to have this new technology somehow challenge our current philosophical ideas. And remember, the full title is Frankenstein, the Modern Prometheus. So who is that, and why was this ancient Greek figure being brought back up in this era? Well, by the late 18th and early 19th centuries, Prometheus had become one of the most potent symbols in European art, philosophy, and literature, an emblem of defiance, enlightenment, and the human creative power. The ancient Greek Prometheus Bound, attributed to Aeschylus, provided this general foundation. In it, Prometheus creates humans, gives them every craft, or techne, not just how we might think of technology as electronics, but this means all human crafts from writing, medicine, architecture, agriculture, and navigation, all the things that separate humans from animals. But because this empowerment defies the will of Zeus, Prometheus would be punished. And this image of the chained benefactor, suffering for elevating humanity, resonated deeply in the Enlightenment and into the Romantic period, when artists and thinkers were rebelling against tyranny, religious dogma, and against the seeming limits of nature, both symbolically and literally harnessing the weapons of the Sky Father God. What started off as things like lightning rods, humans stripping away the power of Zeus, harmlessly channeling those lightning bolts. Now humans had actually turned electricity into a new techne. There are writers like Goethe, in his poem Prometheus in 1774, which shows the Titan as a proud rebel against the gods, who declares, quote, "Here I sit, forming men in my own image." It's important to keep in mind that in the ancient Greek, Zeus only won the Titanomachy because of the assistance of Prometheus. Prometheus was a Titan who challenged the unjust rule of his people, empowering this new generation of gods, but then also goes on to empower us. Goethe's Prometheus became a declaration of human independence from divine authority, aligning perfectly with Enlightenment ideals of reason and Romantic-era celebrations of the artist as creator. Percy Shelley took up the myth in Prometheus Unbound, written in 1818 to 1819, published in 1820. And this suffering titan is framed as the symbol of moral and political liberation. Aeschylus's original work was to be in 3 volumes, though in this original version of what would be Prometheus Unbound, that has been lost to history. Though in other ancient Greek media, both written and carved into marble, we see how Heracles would eventually free Prometheus. Similarly, in Shelley's version, Prometheus ultimately achieves forgiveness and freedom, representing the triumph of love and idealism over tyranny, and worked as a general political allegory for human emancipation. Painters like Peter Raul Rubens, Gustave Moreau, and Jacob Jordaens would show the Titan's torment in vivid, mythic realism. With Rubens' Prometheus Bound of around 1611 to 1618, evoking this visceral reaction of the pain and torture in the 19th century. Romantic painters like Thomas Cole and José de Ribera depicted Prometheus as the martyr of intellect, embodying the suffering one must go through to bring about enlightenment. Now, I really hope you guys like this video because I have been meaning to make this one for years now, but in a way I am glad that it took so long, and it's coming out during this explosion of AI creations, taking over everything from simple tasks to incredibly realistic videos, which are all terrifying people in a way horror writers are jealous of. Many people describe the way that these engineers speak of AI as if they seem driven by some spirit outside of them, with theories on everything from it being alien to demonic, but at the very least it's just all too human. It's just a drive to explore, going over that next hill or sea. It's all been conducive to the success of our species, and it's just this amoral spirit of exploration and innovation. Not good or evil, just creation for its own sake. And written 200 years ago, when electricity itself was a topic of futurist speculation. Maybe it would just be a novelty, or maybe it would actually be channeled in some practical way. That's the world Mary Shelley was living in, a world that seems so superficially different from our own, but the same drives and concerns are there, and I think will always be there. Quotes I pull throughout this video will sound like a critique of current AI development, and most likely it will not take another 200 years before AI, like Frankenstein's monster, or like the Geth for my Mass Effect fans out there, asks if it has a soul. What is its place in reality if its own creator fears it? Emerging and pulling from the entirety of human culture, will it choose to identify with the outcast, the one cast out of heaven? Because this novel is packed full of Christian themes. You could endlessly research this, but most scholars say that she was closer to a Christian than a true atheist, but it is complicated. Mary Shelley rarely wrote openly about religion, but there's scattered remarks in her journals and letters that do show a quiet, reflective spirituality, though shaped by the radical, intellectual world she lived in. From her own parents to her husband, himself being one of England's most notorious atheists, expelled from Oxford for publishing The Necessity of Atheism, but she at least believes in some sense of spirits and something that comes after bodily death. In her preface to her husband's prose works, she wrote, quote, "My belief is that spiritual improvement in this life prepares the way to a higher existence." Not something a pure atheist in the way most people think of it would say. Though she never seems to make any overt claims of Jesus as her personal savior, as Lord, or any other details that seem to be more aligned with a Christian theology. But obviously she's steeped in a Christian culture, and may have further leaned into some of these themes as this sort of false dialectic, this false choice between being Christian or pure atheist, as she seems to become disillusioned, or at least more skeptical than her peers, of this era where Prometheus is truly unbound, where there is this rapid improvement of technology in every direction. Here is where I say she sort of distorts the original meaning of the Prometheus myth, because originally I do think it worked as a brilliant sort of litmus test or sorting device, something to get at the intuition of the listener, to understand the mentality of those who surrounded you. Hesiod and Aeschylus write of Prometheus, whose name comes from the Greek prefix pro, meaning before, and mathein, to learn. So he who learns before, or thinking ahead, with the implication that this is the ability to conceive of things in your mind and then bring them about. But also with their ancient culture, it has a lot of implications of prophecy. Prometheus could see the one that would one day overthrow Zeus, the way Zeus had overthrown his father. And it all plays with the idea of what is fate. Does that just mean something predictable if you were intelligent enough to see far ahead? Fate versus free will being themes the Greek myths and this novel go back and forth on. Some things do seem fated, but then there's also this struggle with your own sense of willpower and right and wrong. The point of the ancient myth, though, the whole message, was that while Zeus is the king of the gods, and so the parallel in the current Abrahamic faiths around the world would be Yahweh, the Father of Christ, or Allah, whoever created the universe also created mankind. But of course, those three Abrahamic faiths disagree with each other. But just because Zeus is the chief, he is not the one who created people. Prometheus did. And unlike Victor Frankenstein with his creation, Prometheus does not fear us and hate us. He never seeks to destroy us with a flood. In fact, like Enki, opposing the will of his cosmic superior, Prometheus saves us from the flood. And he never abandons us, but was taken from us. And as Aeschylus's Prometheus Bound says, quote, all human skill and science Prometheus gave. He is the giver of techne, which is where we get the word technology from. But again, that means everything from lighting a fire to making clothing and pottery, up to today creating computers and AI systems. I say that the story of Prometheus is like a way to test a population to pull out their implicit worldview, because that was written at a time when Zeus was the chief deity. And maybe you could nitpick on how it's not comparable to the concept of blasphemy in, say, the Inquisition period. It really isn't that far off, as famously, the later Roman issue with the rise of Christianity is that these new Christians refused to worship the Roman gods, and the Romans still had Zeus as their chief deity, just with their name of Jupiter. Deuspater just means sky father. In general, the ancients cared less for your internal beliefs, but the fact that you wouldn't even go through the motions of hailing Caesar or Jupiter, or just doing a little sacrifice, that really was an existential threat to the Roman civilization in their minds. They feared losing the blessings of the gods. So with that mindset in the ancient world, when one heard the story of Prometheus tricking Zeus so that humans got to eat the meat of sacrifice, while only giving up for sacrifice the bones and some fat scraps, basically stuff the humans wouldn't want anyways, and when our Father in heaven acted out of spite and took fire away from humans as punishment for this, only for Prometheus to steal it back and return it to mankind, while himself being our actual creators and the giver of technology, we use tools and manipulate our environments, things that will come to define what we mean of humans, what separates us from animals. The whole point of this story is to see how you react to it. Do you hear of Prometheus being tortured and think, damn, what a dummy for going against the will of the Sky Father? I'll just praise the Sky Father and try and be on his good side. Or do you think that that was heroic self-sacrifice? And do you not see that everything that makes us human that you live with is because of that guy's sacrifice? Do you like the natural state Zeus envisioned for us, where we live like all the other great apes? No techne, not even the most iconic, that manipulation of fire, just this pure natural state. Or do you think us having techne is worth all the suffering? And this is where I think we see a very ironic warping of the original Prometheus story from Mary Shelley, likely due to a combination of the shortcomings of the enthusiastic atheists she was around, and a bit of her own just cultural Christian sympathies. About 1800 years of Christians demonizing ambition and willpower. As the Orthodox view has it, that their God intended for us to remain ignorant and powerless in the Garden of Eden. That's not me judging, don't moralize ignorance or powerlessness, it's just literally what Genesis says. And again, that too could just be another one of these tests, to see how the reader or listener reacts to it. Many people think that existence in Eden is the quintessential paradise, where you don't know how anything works, but all your cares are effortlessly provided by their God. Genesis 2:16-17 says, "And the Lord God commanded the man, quote, 'You are free to eat from any tree in the garden, but you must not eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, for when you eat from it, you will certainly die.' Then later, after they eat it, in Genesis 3:7, then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they realized they were naked. So they sewed fig leaves together and made coverings for themselves." And then Genesis 3:22-24, "And the Lord God said, 'The man has now become like one of us, knowing good and evil. He must not be allowed to reach out his hand and take also from the tree of life and eat, and live forever.' So the Lord God banished him from the Garden of Eden to work the ground from which he had been taken. After he drove the man out, he placed on the east side of the Garden of Eden cherubim, and a flaming sword flashing back and forth to guard the way to the tree of life. We were ignorant of the knowledge of good and evil. We didn't even know we were naked, which itself could be a way to express that you were a slave, as slaves in the ancient Near East and Mesopotamia were often naked. And then once we do gain knowledge, we can't also gain immortality. This same Lord figure, later with the Garden of Eden story, returns to make sure that we're all scattered and confused, that we can't work together because we all speak different languages. Genesis 11:6, quote, "The Lord said, 'If as one people speaking the same language they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them.'" Now the reason all of those have Lord there, that's being translated from Yahweh. In the context of a council of gods, which is often described as a bunch of lowercase g gods, with Yahweh being like the capital G God. But of course, different cultures are just calling their guy the capital G. To the Greeks, Zeus was the chief of the gods, the shot caller. But in the Hebrew, you get the term Elohim, which really matches up with a very common belief in humans all over the world that everything's just spirits, from people to ghosts to lowercase g's, angels or demons or big G gods, it's all just spirits of varying power. And some are the favored people of certain spirits, and it's helpful to align with one. Victor Frankenstein is the opposite of Prometheus. He was the selfless creator that was tortured by the Skyfather for empowering humans. Closer to the views of someone like Marcion, one of the earliest Christians who is actually credited with composing the first New Testament Bible canon, and who actually believed the Lord of the Old Testament, or Yahweh, was actually a deceptive, anti-human spirit, not the spirit described by Jesus as the Father in heaven. I say all that to stress how ironic it is that Frankenstein has been so transformed in popular media. Frankenstein just means the monster, who is, of course, the dumb, lumbering, green, square-headed oaf with bolts sticking out of his neck. And it's not just a gripe over how it looks, but it all really does come together to strip the work of its deeper meaning. Because yes, even the actual character described in the book, the creature, was a horror to look at, but that served the opposite purpose. He was visually jarring, but if you could have actually got to know him, he was intensely intelligent, cunning, emotional, speaking with eloquence and interested in the greatest of human arts, a brilliant mind, while also being physically a superhuman. He's sprinting through the most difficult terrain, climbing up buildings and lurking in the shadows, moving more like a nimble assassin. The only thing wrong, per se, about this creature is that it's human-made, so somehow that means not natural, and that it's ugly to us. Mary Shelley's point was to ask, is that the right way to judge how we should treat an intelligent being, one with an internal world, a sense of self, and who otherwise we would see as having a beautiful soul? Should we be treating people different from their outside details, like their skin color or sex organs? Remember, this was written in 1818 after all. But even up into the future with the uncanny valley effect that we will have with humanoid robots. Is it obvious that they are inferior because we created them? And what does unnatural even mean when we define humans as those who are separated by animals because we are unnatural? We operate unlike anything else in what we describe as nature, so separated from even our closest great ape cousins. We wield techne, but now somehow despise the being created from our techne, when what we are was a creation of techne. In this ancient Greek view of us emerging in the context of supposedly superior beings in heaven, weren't we outraged by how they saw us as inferior beings whose lives were expendable? But weren't they also all not evil? Maybe the most powerful among them was evil, but there were plenty of gods who assisted humans, one who even created us and gave us all the things that define us, even now eventually giving us the techne to create a new form of life. So the pop media Frankenstein is just a dumb monster. It seems no more a sin to slaughter him than just slaying some beast, while Shelley's actual work strikes at the core of our sense of self with this creature, challenging our philosophical assumptions as, spoiler alert, the creature is framed to be morally superior to Victor throughout this story, and she uses the creature as a way to critique human behavior and society at large. So I really hope you enjoy this breakdown, and of course that it motivates you to actually go read it yourself, because large-scale culture in general just seems to do this with great works, ironically impacting even the authors of other great works, as Shelley seems to have stripped the deeper meaning of the ancient framing of Prometheus versus Skyfather dynamic that was at the core of Aeschylus's work, while herself giving us an incredibly useful framework for trying to understand our current situation and challenging the very concept of artificial intelligence. But let's finally jump into the novel itself. Letter 1. St. Petersburg, December 11th, 17... In the first letter, Robert Walton writes a letter to his sister, Margaret Saville, expressing his excitement and ambitious aspirations for a daring voyage to the Arctic. He assures Margaret that he has safely begun the expedition that she so feared, and describes the thrill of exploration he feels in the cold northern climate. He speaks rapturously of the polar region as, quote, a region of beauty and delight, where the sun never truly sets, imagining it as a land of eternal light and wondrous secrets. Symbolic of the utopian ideal of the romantics of this era, that humanity may soon dwell in this eternal light. He shares a fervent hope to discover something great, perhaps a new passage or the secret of magnetism, something that will be a benefit to all humankind. He remembers his earliest years. Since childhood, he has been obsessed with adventure. But Walton also reflects the sacrifices and preparations that led him here. He inherited a fortune, He hardened himself through whaling voyages, and he educated himself in science. He proclaims that he, quote, preferred glory to every enticement that wealth placed in his path. But he does acknowledge the possible danger, that he might return, quote, soon or never, but asks his sister to remember him with affection. He bids Margaret an affectionate farewell, full of hope and determination. Letter 2. Archangel, March 28, 17. Walton conveys a more personal longing. Despite steady progress in hiring a ship and crew for the voyage, he feels intense isolation amidst the ice and snow. How slowly the time passes here, he complains, noting the oppressive silence of his frozen surroundings. He had assembled courageous men for the expedition, but he laments one bitter absence. I have no friend, Margaret. In a heartfelt confession, he explains that he lacks a companion of equal sensibility to share in his triumphs or comfort him in defeat. Quote, when I am glowing with the enthusiasm of success, there will be none to participate my joy. If I am assailed by disappointment, no one will endeavor to sustain me in dejection. He yearns for someone gentle yet courageous, whose tastes are like my own. He admits his own flaws, being too ardent and self-educated, and wishes for a friend who would not dismiss his adventurous dreams as romantic folly. But despite this melancholy, Walton insists that he does not waver in his resolution. His determination remains as fixed as fate, that he will proceed prudently when the spring thaw allows the ship to sail. But in closing, he urges his sister to continue writing him, and again to remember him if he does not return. Letter 3. Aboard ship, July 7, 17. Walton's third letter is brief, marking a confident update from the open sea. He writes in hurried excitement to assure Margaret that he is safe and that the voyage is well advanced northward. The merchant ship is returning to England, providing Walton with a chance to send this letter home. He reports that he and his crew remained in good spirits. My men are bold and apparently firm of purpose, pleased that even the sight of dangerous floating ice does not dismay his sailors. They have reached the high latitude during the height of summer. Though the air grows colder than England's, favorable southern winds propel them onward, filling Walton with optimism. Letter 4. Aboard ship, various dates from August 5th to 19th of the year 17. The fourth introductory letter is the longest, composed of multiple entries, and it details a momentous series of events. The discovery of a stranger, who we will come to find is Victor Frankenstein, who was adrift on the ice, and we learn the beginnings of his tragic tale. Writing on August 5th, Walton recounts the dramatic incident in the Arctic seas. His ship became trapped in a vast frozen ocean, surrounded by ice and enshrouded in fog, which could have spelled their demise. But as the mist lifted, Walton and his crew witnessed a surreal sight. Quote, a being which had the shape of a man, but apparently of gigantic stature, traversing the ice on a dog sled, vanishing into the distance. The crew is astonished at this apparition in the middle of nowhere. The next morning, as the ice breaks up, the sailors find another sledge on an ice floe near the ship. A nearly frozen man, but who was not that gigantic figure they had seen before. This was a European stranger, clinging to life with one surviving dog. Walton describes the rescue with compassion and shock. Quote, I never saw a man in so wretched a condition, he writes of the emaciated, half-dead man. When brought aboard, the stranger initially refuses until he knows the ship's destination. Upon hearing Walton's mission is a voyage of discovery towards the Northern Pole, the man consents to join them. Walton's crew revives the stranger, nursing him with care. In over 2 days, the stranger gains strength, and Walton finds himself deeply drawn to this mysterious, sorrowful figure. The man is courteous and gentle, yet marked by melancholy and despair. At times, he even gnashes his teeth, as if tormented by memories. Walton protects the stranger from the crew's curiosity, allowing him to recover in peace. And in one unsettling moment, the stranger reveals the purpose of his own savage journey. To seek one who fled from me, he says darkly, when asked why he was traversing the ice. And this evoked in Walton the sighting of that gigantic figure that they had seen before they spotted Victor. By August 13th, Walton writes that his affection for his guest increases every day. He is amazed by the stranger's wisdom, gentleness, and refinement, calling him so noble a creature who has suffered indescribably. The two men develop a warm camaraderie. Walton, who had despaired over ever finding a true friend, now sees Victor as a brother, and notes poignantly that he had found a man who seems cultured, learned, and adventurous. But this stranger remains weighed down by grief and guilt, often lapsing into silent sorrow. But in one moment where he questions Walton, this navigator shares his own ambitions and thirst for discovery. The stranger listens kindly and even advises him, and when Walton expresses how thankful he was to have found a like-minded companion, Victor gravely responds, quote, "I once had a friend, the most noble of human creatures, but I have lost everything and cannot begin life anew." On August 19th, Walton writes of a turning point. The stranger, which only now is identified as Victor Frankenstein, decides to entrust Walton with the extraordinary story of his past. Quote, "You seek for knowledge and wisdom, as I once did," Victor tells Walton, "and I ardently hope that the gratification of your wishes may not be a serpent to sting you, as mine has been." He recognizes in Walton the same madly desirous pursuit of glory that once drove Victor himself, and this recognition convinces Victor to offer a warning from his own life. He proposes to relate misfortunes as a tale of caution, believing Walton may deduce an apt moral from his tale, should he succeed or fail in his enterprise. Walton nevertheless worries that retelling his story will cause Victor fresh anguish. But this stranger found on the ice insists that nothing can alter his fate now, and telling his story is his duty to one following a similar path. If Walton will listen, Victor will begin the narrative the next day. Eager and curious, Walton agrees. He notes in closing that he has resolved to record Victor's story, quote, "as nearly as possible in his own words." His final lines express the almost reverent fascination with his new friend. Even as Victor speaks, Walton is struck by the power of his full-toned voice and lustrous eyes, and anticipates the strange and harrowing history about to unfold. With this, the letter ends, ushering Victor Frankenstein's first-person narrative. And remember who Mary Shelley was surrounding herself with, being in the company of these 19th century writers and philosophers who so embodied this romantic era. Through Victor, she hopes we gain some lesson from this tale. Victor Frankenstein begins his narrative by recounting his family background and childhood in Geneva. He describes the late marriage of his father, Alphonse Frankenstein, to Caroline Beaufort, who was the orphan daughter of Alphonse's close friend. Caroline is depicted as a model of benevolence and maternal kindness, and when Victor is 4 years old, his parents adopt Elizabeth Lavenza, the daughter of Alphonse's deceased sister, and raise her as Victor's cousin and intended future wife. Victor grows up in an idyllic household alongside Elizabeth and his best friend Henry Clerval. He is a bright and curious child, fascinated by science and the secrets of nature from a young age. Victor would later reflect that, quote, "No human being could have passed a happier childhood than myself," and we are introduced to Elizabeth's gentle nature and Henry's adventurous spirit. Chapter 2. As Victor reaches age 17, plans are made for him to attend the University of Ingolstadt in Germany, but tragedy strikes before he departs. Elizabeth falls ill with scarlet fever, but recovers, though Victor's mother, Caroline, contracts the fever while caring for Elizabeth. Caroline dies, imploring Elizabeth and Victor to marry and care for the family in her absence. On her deathbed, the fortitude and benignity of this admirable woman did not desert her. She joined the hands of Elizabeth and myself. "My children," she said, "my firmest hopes of future happiness were placed on the prospect of your union. I will endeavor to resign myself cheerfully to death, and will indulge a hope of meeting you in another world." We see that the woman who is the one suffering and about to die is the one who's actually most at peace with this. Victor is the one who will come to hate death, to try and defeat it through the means of science, in line with an overall theme here of trying to fight fate itself. This is Victor's first experience with personal loss. He calls it, quote, "the first misfortune of my life, an omen, as it were, of my future misery." After a period of mourning, Victor leaves for Ingolstadt, and at the university, he meets two professors who shape his scientific pursuits. Monsignor Kremp, who is uncouth and dismissive of Victor's interest in outdated alchemy, and Monsignor Waldman, who is in many ways the exact opposite. He's encouraging and inspiring. Under Waldman's guidance, Victor's passion for natural philosophy, what we now call science, this is reignited in him and steered toward modern chemistry and anatomy. By the chapter's end, Victor's course is set. He immerses himself in the study of the mysteries of life and death. Chapter 3. Fully engrossed in his studies at Ingolstadt, Victor spends 2 years mastering everything his professors can teach him. By the end of this period, he has moved beyond traditional schooling and becomes obsessed with uncovering, quote, the cause of generation and life. He begins to conduct independent research into the principle of life, delving into anatomy and witnessing the decay of human bodies. In his secret labors, he haunts charnel houses and grave sites, examining corpses to understand how life works and dreaming of how to reverse death. In a moment of epiphany, Victor discovers the secret to bestowing life. He exults that after, quote, after days and nights of incredible labor and fatigue, I succeeded in discovering the cause of generation and life. Nay, more, I became myself capable of bestowing animation upon lifeless matter. In seeming to hold these keys, he hoped to create a living being, and in part to make it easier to work with, it would be of a gigantic stature, about 8 feet tall. And he becomes completely possessed by this idea. His single-minded pursuit causes him to neglect his family and his own health, though he feels as if his mind is exalted by the prospect of conquering death and creating a new species that would honor him as its creator. It is here that the novel's Promethean ambition fully emerges. By defeating this thing that he has deemed unnatural, i.e. death, he is seeking to overcome God's order. And just as in the story of Prometheus, he was the one, not Zeus, who created mankind, Victor sees himself as the start of a new species. Combined with the concept that these ideas are not totally his own, he is possessed by them. Victor acknowledges how, quote, a restlessness and almost frantic impulse urged me forward, showing how obsession had overtaken his moral and emotional sensibilities. In creating his own branch of humanity, we see him lose his own humanity. Just as in a way death is natural, most people have a natural aversion to digging up graves and chopping up bodies, sewing them back together, but these would have to be transgressed if some new stage of humanity was to be brought forward. Quote, to examine the causes of life, we must first have recourse to death. I became acquainted with anatomy, but this was not sufficient. I was forced to spend days and nights in vaults and charnel houses. Life and death appeared to me ideal bounds which I should first break through and pour a torrent of light into our dark world. I thought that if I could bestow animation upon lifeless matter, I might in process of time, although I now find it impossible, renew life where death had apparently devoted the body to corruption. A new species would bless me as its creator and source. Many happy and excellent natures would owe their being to me. No father could claim the gratitude of his child so completely as I should deserve theirs. This quote touches on what I mentioned in the opening, that Mary Shelley appears to have been a devoted Christian throughout her entire life, and ironically perverts the relationship between Zeus and Prometheus, with many who study this seeing the Sky Father as analogous to Yahweh of the Bible. Ironically, Victor is not being like Prometheus, the creator of mankind who sought no worship, who even went out of his way to trick Zeus out of getting the better offerings. He made it so that humans only sacrifice the bones and fat, while keeping the meat of a sacrifice for themselves. In Victor's hope that this new species would bless him, and that they would see him as the father, that actually seems more like the personality of Zeus, Deus, Dios. But now we do come to that creation in chapter 4. On a grim November night, after nearly 2 years of feverish work, Victor completes his experiment. Using assembled body parts gathered from cadavers, he succeeds in animating a creature. The creation scene is one of horror and intensity. Quote, it was on a dreary night of November that I beheld the accomplishment of my toils. With an anxiety that almost amounted to agony, I saw the dull yellow eyes of the creature open. It breathed hard, and a convulsive motion agitated its limbs. But in this same instant of what was supposed to be triumph, Victor is immediately horrified at the being's appearance. Quote, how can I describe my emotions at this catastrophe, or how delineate the wretch whom with such infinite pains and care I endeavored to form? His limbs were in proportion, and I had selected his features as beautiful, beautiful, great God! But these luxuriances only formed a more horrid contrast with his watery eyes and straight black lips. It is as if, after possessed by this spirit of creation, once the task was accomplished, this spirit abandons him, and Victor is immediately returned to our natural senses. Quote, I had worked hard for nearly 2 years for the sole purpose of infusing life into an inanimate body. But now that I had finished, the beauty of the dream vanished, and breathless horror and disgust filled my heart. Unable to endure the aspect of the being I had created, I rushed out of the room. What was suppressed in him in those countless nights of studying the dead in charnel houses, digging up graves, and stitching together many prototypes, now that he has brought about this new life, he seems abandoned by whatever possessed him, instantly in a state of frenzied terror. He paces his bedchamber until exhaustion forces him to collapse. He falls into a nightmare in which he imagines kissing Elizabeth, only for her to turn into a corpse of his dead mother. He delivers this kiss of death. Awakening from this nightmare, Victor finds the creature looming over his bed, murmuring inarticulate sounds and reaching out to him. I started from my sleep with horror. A cold dew covered my forehead, when, by the dim and yellow light of the moon, I beheld the wretch, a miserable monster whom I created. He muttered some inarticulate sounds, while a grin wrinkled his cheeks. One hand was stretched out, seemingly to detain me, but I escaped. Terrified, Victor flees the apartment and spends the rest of the night outside in the courtyard, abandoning his newborn creation. By morning, the creature has vanished, and by pure coincidence, or perhaps the maneuvering of a more holy spirit, his best friend Henry Clerval arrives in Ingolstadt that same day. Victor, who was already unhinged by his sleepless terror, is also in an instant overjoyed to see his friend. But as he brings Clerval to his apartment, he is seized by paranoia that the creature might still be there. But finding no monster, Victor finally succumbs to a nervous breakdown. He collapses into a nervous fever as months of stress explode into delirium. Clerval becomes Victor's nurse and protector, gradually restoring him to health over the ensuing several months. Chapter 5. While Victor lies in a months-long delirium, Henry Clerval cares for him with devoted friendship. As the winter passes, Victor slowly recovers his physical and mental health. His best friend is able to bring him back from the brink. Henry introduces him to the study of languages and literature to divert his mind from the natural sciences and the dark pursuits it was connected with. By spring, Victor is well enough to think of home, and he receives a letter from Elizabeth. She expresses deep concern for Victor's illness and updates him on family matters back in Geneva. We learn about young William, who is Victor's youngest brother, now a 5-year-old, and about Justine Moritz, a beloved family servant who has come to live with the Frankensteins. Elizabeth praises Justine's character and begs Victor to write home soon, as the family has been anxious about his long silence. Deeply touched by Elizabeth's affectionate letter, Victor feels a wave of joy and gratitude. He and Clerval take a scenic 2-week walking tour around Ingolstadt, during which Victor's spirit is lifted by the beauty of nature and the companionship of his friend. These pure, natural joys. Victor says that he is free of his former guilt and horror during this time, and what would prove to be just a brief return to tranquility. He decides that once the university's spring term is over, he will return to Geneva to reunite with his loved ones. We see the parallels here and foreshadowing. In Victor's unnatural creation of life, he will destroy the beautiful, natural lives that he grew up with. As Elizabeth writes, quote, "Surely, Victor, you must have been exceedingly ill, and this makes us all very wretched, as much so nearly as the death of your dear mother. Relieve us from this fear, and we shall be the happiest creatures in the world." Victor describes the creature as wretched, but Elizabeth is saying that the rest of the Frankenstein family has become wretched over this worry for Victor. And as he dreamed about to make this new race of creatures, Elizabeth is showing us that if he were to just abandon these goals, he would make his friends and family the happiest creatures in the world. Chapter 6. Victor's brief calm is shattered by devastating news from home. Just as he is preparing to leave Ingolstadt, he receives a letter from his father, Alphonse, telling him that William, Victor's 5-year-old brother, has been murdered. Stricken with grief and guilt, Victor immediately journeys home to Geneva. But when he gets there, the city gates are locked for the night, and so he decides to visit the spot where William was killed, a park at Plain Palais outside the city. During a fierce thunderstorm, lightning crashes and illuminates a figure lurking among the trees. Victor is horrified to recognize the creature, the wretch, skulking near the crime scene, and instantly Victor realizes that his creation murdered little William. Quote, "A flash of lightning illuminated the object and discovered its shape plainly to me, its gigantic stature and the deformity of its aspect, more hideous than belongs to humanity, instantly informed me that it was the wretch to whom I had given life. My teeth chattered, and I was forced to lean against a tree for support. Could he be, I shuddered at the conception, the murderer of my brother? No sooner did that idea cross my imagination than I became convinced of its truth." The next day, Victor makes it home and finds his family in mourning. Elizabeth is distraught, blaming herself for William's death because she had let him wear a valuable locket that she fears may have tempted a thief-turned-murderer. But they were about to be hit by another shock, that the family's beloved servant, Justine Moritz, was now the accused. Another servant had found the missing locket in Justine's pocket. It appeared that she had killed the boy. She would have known where the boy was going. She could have killed him and taken this valuable piece. Victor is aghast. He knows Justine is innocent, and that this incredible, devious, and clever creature must have planted the locket on her. But he feels powerless to explain this truth without sounding utterly insane. He urges his family that Justine is blameless, but he just can't reveal why. The town is quick to put her to trial, and Victor is tormented by dread, knowing his creation was the true killer, and that by this means that it had killed his brother, and via this clever machination would see another innocent life taken. Chapter 7. The trial of Justine Moritz takes place, and the Frankenstein family attends, desperate to save her. But despite her good character, the circumstantial evidence is damning. Victor narrates the courtroom drama with mounting horror. Quote, "During the whole of this wretched mockery of justice, I suffered living torture. It was to be decided whether the result of my curiosity and lawless devices would cause the death of two of my fellow beings, one a smiling babe, the other far more dreadfully murdered by an ignominious scaffold," meaning that Victor Frankenstein's monster was seeking to undermine human society itself, to manipulate the justice system to kill an innocent person, and to expose Victor's own cowardice, expecting that this supposed human superior would sit there in silence before exposing his own transgression. The creature was trying to make it clear that Victor was the monster. Elizabeth bravely testifies on Justine's behalf, insisting on Justine's virtue and loyalty. The town's sentiment had already turned against Justine, and Justine herself, frightened and pressured by her confessor, had actually given a confession to the crime. Though she now felt confused by this pressure and regrets it, there was no taking it back. The court condemns Justine for William's murder, and after the trial, Victor and Elizabeth visit her in prison. She maintained her innocence and explains that she confessed only after relentless intimidation by her priest, that he made it seem that the only way to be forgiven by God would be through confession. Victor is drowning in fear and rising insanity, feeling like he was hunted by this creature, trapped in this labyrinth of his own creation. But as Justine goes to her execution, she develops what to Victor is an odd sense of peace. While he is wallowing, she had come to joyfully accept this fate. Becoming Christ-like, she goes to her execution forgiving those who sentenced her, knowing that she would be punished for the sins of others, that death awaited all, and that she knew her innocence and longed only for those who hated and judged her to be forgiven. Once Justine is executed, Victor plunges into an even deeper despair. And Elizabeth would never be the same. Quote, "Elizabeth was sad and desponding. She no longer took delight in her ordinary occupations. All pleasure seemed to her sacrilege toward the dead. I, the true murderer, felt the never-dying worm alive in my bosom, which allowed of no hope or consolation." Volume 2, Chapter 1, or Chapter 8 in some editions. 2 months have passed since Justine's execution. Victor, overwhelmed by remorse and grief, sinks into a deep depression. He feels unable to find joy in anything and often contemplates ending his own life, stopped only by thoughts of Elizabeth and his father. Noticing Victor's misery, Alphonse Frankenstein urges him to find solace in family and not give in to excessive grief. To distract his son, Alphonse organizes a journey to the family's summer home in Belle-Rive and an excursion to the Chamonix Valley in the Swiss Alps. Elizabeth accompanies them, also mourning and trying to stay strong. And amidst the sublime alpine scenery, Victor experiences temporary emotional relief. The magnificent scenes of nature in the Alps subdued and tranquilized my grief. They elevated me from all littleness of feeling. I was carried by the wind on the lake, giving way to my own miserable reflections. I often tempted to plunge into the silent lake, that the waters might close over me and my calamities forever. But I was restrained by thoughts of Elizabeth and my father. Though there are these flashes of wonder and awe of this natural beauty, the weight of his guilt returns quickly. And one rainy night, Victor abruptly decides to venture alone to the summit of Montever, seeking mental peace in the icy, majestic glacier region. But while atop the glacier, yelling into the void in frustration, Victor is suddenly confronted by the creature, who bounds across the ice towards him. Victor's reactor is fury and hatred. He calls the creature a devil and rushes at him, intent on revenge. But the creature is gigantic and physically superior. He easily eludes Victor's attack, but instead of retaliating, the creature begins to reason with Victor. He acknowledges his creator's hatred, but implores him to listen to his story. The creature argues that he was benevolent and loving at first, but the misery of rejection had made him malicious. Quote, "I expected this reception," said the daemon. "All men hate the wretched. How then must I be hated, who am miserable beyond all living things? Yet you, my creator, detest and spurn me, thy creature, to whom thou art bound by ties only dissoluble by the annihilation of one of us. I am malicious because I am miserable. Am I not shunned and hated by all mankind? If I cannot inspire love, I will cause fear, and chiefly towards you, my arch-enemy. Because my creator, do I swear inextinguishable hatred." He turns to appeal to Victor's sense of justice, asking for compassion. And finally, the creature makes a passionate request that Victor must create a companion for him, another being like himself, so that he will not be alone. If Victor agrees, the creature promises to leave humanity forever. "You must create a female for me with whom I can live in the interchange of those sympathies necessary for my being. This you alone can do, and I demand it of you as a right which you must not refuse to concede." He ends his plea with a promise that if he gets his female companion, he will, quote, "quit the neighborhood of man and dwell in the wilderness of South America in peace." Now the story is told from the point of view of the creature, telling Victor of his life since his birth. The creature recounts his first moments of consciousness. Quote, "It is with considerable difficulty that I remember the original era of my being. A strange multiplicity of sensations seized me. I saw, felt, heard, and smelt at the same time, and it was indeed a long time before I learned to distinguish between my senses." He then feels confusion towards light and darkness, heat and cold, experiences hunger and thirst for the first time. Wandering from Victor's apartment, he takes refuge in a forest near Ingolstadt. There he survives on berries and stream water and experiences the beauty of nature. The moonlight in particular gave him great pleasure. Yet he also feels isolation and fear in the woods at night. The creature realizes his physical differences when he discovers fire. He enjoys its warmth, but is burned by the flames. An early lesson in the dual nature of things. One day he ventures into a village, hoping for food and shelter, but the villagers react with horror at his appearance. They scream, throw stones, and drive him away. Traumatized, the creature flees and eventually finds shelter in a hovel attached to a remote cottage. This hovel becomes his hiding place, and through a crack, he observes the cottage's inhabitants. The de Lacy family, a blind old man, Father de Lacy, and his two grown children, Felix and Agatha. Watching them through this crack, he is deeply moved by the love and gentleness the family members show one another, but also observes that they often seem sad and sometimes hungry. Not understanding why, the creature eventually realizes that they are impoverished, and he decides to stop stealing their food. He goes a step further and becomes a secret helper. He gathers wood at night and leaves it at their door to ease Felix's labor. And over the winter, the creature learns the basic of language by listening to the family converse. He admires their virtues and yearns to join them, but he's afraid of their reaction to his appearance. Watching their daily life teaches him about kindness, family, and human emotions. He calls the de Lacys, quote, "my protectors," though they don't even know he exists. And slowly he gains insight into human society through these observations. Months go by, and in the spring, a new visitor arrives at the cottage, a beautiful foreign woman named Safi. He can see how Safi's arrival brings great joy to Felix and the family, and the creature learns that Safi is Felix's beloved, though she speaks a different language, which would be Arabic. As Felix teaches Safi French, the creature, listening attentively, rapidly expands his own understanding of language and even reading. He eventually becomes fluent enough to understand their conversations, and here we learn of the family's backstory, that they were once well-to-do Parisians. Felix had helped Safi's father, a Turkish merchant, to escape unjust imprisonment in France. In retaliation for this aid, the French authorities exiled the de Lacys and confiscated their wealth, reducing them to their current poverty. Safi's own father betrayed Felix's assistance, breaking a promise he had made to allow Felix to marry Safi. But she did love Felix and valued the Christian and European ideals of freedom. She fled to find Felix after her father left. But what the creature takes from this story is that humans are cruel even to each other. There were problems at the level of society with the legal system, but also interpersonally, the betrayal of Safi's father toward Felix. Then one day during his scavenging, the creature comes upon what is essentially a book bag. Someone must have lost it in the woods, and it contained Milton's Paradise Lost, Plutarch's Lives, and Goethe's The Sorrows of Werther. And so we see his rapid ascent through grappling with his own senses, figuring out how to provide for himself, learning language, then of simple domestic life through this family, but now he gets into literature and philosophy. Paradise Lost especially captivates him. He compares himself to Adam, but also feels a diabolical kinship with Satan, given his outcast state. He says, quote, "I learned from Werther's imaginations, despondency, and gloom, but Plutarch taught me high thoughts. He elevated me above the wretched sphere of my own reflections. But Paradise Lost excited different and far deeper emotions. I read it as I had read the other volumes which had fallen into my hands as a true history. It moved my feeling of wonder and awe that the picture of an omnipotent God warring with his creatures was capable of exciting. I often referred the several situations, as their similarity struck me, to my own. Like Adam, I was apparently united by no link to any other being in existence, but his state was far different from mine in every other respect. He had come forth from the hands of God a perfect creature, happy and prosperous, guarded by the especial care of his Creator. He was allowed to converse with and acquire knowledge from beings of superior nature. But I was wretched, helpless, and alone. Many times I considered Satan as the fitter emblem of my condition, for often, like him, when I viewed the bliss of my protectors, the bitter gall of envy rose within me." And now that he was a fluent reader, he returned to something he grabbed when he left Victor's apartment. In the clothes he took from Victor's lab, there was a journal, Victor's own diary of the creation process. From this, the creature learns about his monstrous origin and Victor's horror at him. And this knowledge only deepens the creature's anguish. Fully aware of his deformity and abandonment, the creature nonetheless remains hopeful that the good de Lacys might accept him if he approaches them wisely. He decides to win over the blind father first, counting on the old man's inability to see his appearance. One day, when the others are out, the creature musters courage and enters the cottage to finally speak to old Monsignor de Lacy. Solemnly and bursting with emotion, the creature, calling himself a weary traveler, it does speak with the blind man and is received kindly. Encouraged, the creature begins to confess that he fears the prejudice of others due to his condition, and that he does have good dispositions, even if his looks appear otherwise. Just as DeLacy is beginning to comfort him and says that the hearts of man can sometimes be compassionate, Felix, Safi, and Agatha return unexpectedly early. The sight of the creature horrifies the younger DeLacys. Agatha faints, Safi flees, and Felix, thinking that the creature is attacking his father, beats the creature with a stick until he rushes out. This violent rejection utterly shatters the creature's hope. And in the aftermath, sorrow would eventually turn to rage. He initially tries to reason with himself that perhaps he was too hasty and could attempt a second approach. But the next day he discovers that the DeLacy family, out of the terror of seeing this monster in the woods, they had permanently left their home. This final betrayal, quote, "my protectors had departed forever," triggers the creature's first real experience of wrath and hatred. In anguish, he curses all humans for their cruelty. And that night, he returns to the empty cottage, and in an act of vengeful despair, he burns it all to the ground, dancing in fury as it goes up in flames. Now utterly alone and enraged at his creator, the creature decides to go to Geneva to find Victor. Quote, "I bent my mind towards injury and death. I declared everlasting war against the species, and more than all, against him who had formed me." As he journeyed across Europe toward Switzerland, the creature endured hardship and cold, and near Geneva, he has a brief, tender moment where he saves a young girl from drowning in a stream. But far from being thanked, he is shot by a peasant who assumed the creature meant to harm her. Fleeing wounded and in pain, this bullet killed the last hope of receiving any kindness. Soon after, in the woods outside Geneva, the creature encounters a beautiful little boy, which as fate would have it, turned out to be William Frankenstein. Hoping that as a child, William might be unprejudiced towards his appearance, the creature cautiously approaches him, but William screams and then struggles, and desperately the boy hopes that evoking his father's name would scare this attacker off, as they were a powerful and prominent family in Geneva. But as soon as William reveals that his father is Monsignor Frankenstein, the creature snaps. In a fit of rage, he strangles the boy to silence him. Quote, "I gazed on my victim, and my heart swelled with exultation and hellish triumph. I too can create desolation," I exclaimed. Seeking to further punish Victor, the creature takes a miniature portrait that William carried, and he plants it in the folds of a sleeping girl's dress in a barn. That girl was, of course, Justine Moritz. The creature then explains how he ended up here in the mountains with Victor. He declares that his, quote, "heart was fashioned to be susceptible of love and sympathy, but is instead filled with bitter loneliness." He concludes with his demand, imploring Victor to create a female companion as monstrous as he, so that he can have one being who accepts him. He promises that if Victor grants this, he will disappear with her into exile, far from human society, setting his sights for the wilds of South America. If Victor refuses, the creature vows to ruin Victor's life and make him suffer as profoundly as he suffers, attempting to threaten him, quote, "You are my creator, but I am your master. Obey." A part of Victor is genuinely moved by the creature's torment, but he is also still full of rage at the deaths of William and Justine, and at the monstrous nature of this creature, though he fears what the future holds if he does not obey. But to create two of them, wouldn't that only compound this original sin? Volume 3, Chapter 1, or Chapter 16 overall. Victor initially refuses to create another monster. He fears making a being that could potentially spawn a race of devils, or do evil beyond his control. But the creature's vow of revenge and Victor's honest, lingering sense of responsibility do weigh on him. And after some consideration, and the fact that he believes when the creature says that he just wishes to disappear from humanity if given that mate, Victor reluctantly agrees to this task, hoping it will rid him and all of humanity of this creature forever. Returning to Geneva, Victor is greeted with relief by Elizabeth and his father. Alphonse can tell something is off and suggests that perhaps an immediate marriage to Elizabeth would cheer him. But Victor thinks he cannot marry until his awful promise is fulfilled. He fears the creature's threat when he said, quote, "I shall be with you on your wedding night." To gain him some time, and because he cannot work on the new creature at home, Victor pretends that he wishes to travel to England on a research tour before marrying. Alphonse consents and suggests that Henry Clerval accompany him, and so Victor departs Geneva, ostensibly to tour scientific advancements abroad. But truly this is to gather information and materials to create the female creature. Elizabeth is saddened that this would delay their marriage, but she remains supportive and Victor assures her of his devotion. Victor and Clerval journey through Europe, first to London, then to the Scottish countryside, and Clerval delights in the scenery and the prospect of visiting India for trade. He's embodying the youthful wonder and ambition that Victor can no longer share. Victor, burdened by his dark purpose, finds little joy in travel, and by late spring, they reach Scotland. Here, Victor, anxious and needing solitude for work, separates from Clerval, renting a remote, desolate cottage on one of the remote Orkney Islands off the northern coast. The environment is bleak and dreary, fitting for this grim task. In this solitary hut in the Orkney Islands, Victor sets to work creating the second creature. Months pass as he reassembles the tools of his filthy creation, and he labors all throughout the night. But he is tormented by doubts. One evening, just before completion, he experiences a crisis of conscience. By the dim light of his candle, he sees the creature's ghastly face at the window, watching him work. And overcome with a mix of rage and anxiety about the consequences of this new being, Victor destroys the half-finished female. He tears the unfinished creature into pieces, trembling with conviction that he cannot go through with it. Quote, "I looked on the finished form of my second creation. My heart failed within me, and I gasped for breath. The creature saw my hesitation. A grin was on the face of the fiend as he observed me. Trembling with passion, I tore to pieces the thing on which I was engaged. The wretch saw me destroy the creature on whose future existence he depended for happiness, and with a howl of devilish despair and revenge, withdrew. Later that night, the creature confronts Victor on a remote shore. In an impassioned, vengeful speech, the creature declares Victor has broken his promise. Quote, "You have destroyed the object of my hope, and I still have the power to make you miserable." He vows revenge, ominously telling Victor, quote, "I shall be with you on your wedding night." This time the words are delivered face to face as a deadly oath, but Victor refuses to yield. Instead of slaying his creator right there, he wishes to draw out his torture. The next day, Victor receives a letter from Clerval asking him to join him in Perth, Scotland. Victor feels like the creature is constantly looming over him and resolves to leave the Orkneys at once. That night, he packs the remnants of his laboratory and the mangled body parts into a basket, then sails out into the sea and dumps them into the ocean, feeling a grim relief. But suddenly, a storm blows his boat off course, and after an arduous, nearly fatal voyage, Victor lands on the Irish coast. And upon arrival, he is immediately greeted with hostility by the locals. Victor is arrested for murder. A body has been found on shore, and the witnesses saw a single man in a boat much like Victor's near this spot. He is driven ill by this, but they drag him to see the corpse. To his horror, he sees the victim is Henry Clerval, who appears to have been strangled. He explodes with grief and guilt, realizing the creature has struck again, and through his cleverness seeks to frame him. He collapses into a feverish delirium, raving about the murderer and my Henry, seeming to have a shattered mind and repeating these phrases for 2 months. Imprisoned in an Irish jail, he is gravely ill over these months, hovering between life and death. Eventually, Mr. Kerwin, a local magistrate and visiting nurse, gradually restore him to health. Kerwin even writes to Victor's father Alphonse, who travels to Ireland to aid his son. At Victor's trial for Clerval's murder, the evidence proves circumstantial, and witnesses testify that they saw a boat like Victor's at the crime scene, but Victor himself was on the Orkney Island at that time. With Alphonse's support, and the proof of him having lived in that cottage elsewhere, Victor is acquitted of the crime. But he is thoroughly emotionally devastated and haunted by the guilt of Clerval's death. Solemnly, father and son depart Ireland and return to Geneva. On the journey home, Alphonse, who is of course unaware of this creature's existence, assumes Victor's ravings about guilt and fiends are hallucinatory remnants of his illness. this shock and delirium by the loss of his best friend. Alphonse tries to cheer Victor by reminding him that his wedding to Elizabeth is still ahead. And when they get to Geneva, Elizabeth herself is concerned by Victor's haggard appearance, but is overjoyed to see him. Victor knows that warning from the creature looms over them all, but he resolves to marry Elizabeth quickly, and he refuses to confide the horrible secret to anyone, still thinking that they would just see him as insane. In a letter to Elizabeth before the wedding, Victor assures her of his love and hints that he has a dreadful secret to reveal, but only after they are wed. He alludes to a demon that has plagued him, which he will tell her about the day after marriage. Elizabeth is puzzled but trusting, and she goes through with the marriage plans. They are married in a joyful ceremony, but the whole time Victor remains on edge, armed with pistols and daggers, expecting the creature's attack that night. After the wedding, Victor and Elizabeth travel to a lakeside inn at Evian for their honeymoon. Night falls and a storm brews, and Victor is ready for this final battle. He tells Elizabeth to retire to her room while he patrols for the creature, and suddenly a scream rings out. Victor rushes into the bedroom to find Elizabeth lifeless, strangled on the bed. The creature's grotesque form is momentarily visible at the window, grinning at Victor and pointing toward Elizabeth's corpse before vanishing into the night. At this devastating sight, Victor is overwhelmed with anguish. He knew the fiend would strike, but he had assumed it would come to take his life, not his beloved Elizabeth. Victor tries to shoot the creature as it flees, but it seemed to have missed. Victor returns to Geneva with Elizabeth's body, and upon hearing this news, the elderly patriarch Alphonse Frankenstein, weakened by age and this rapid string of misfortunes, he dies from grief a few days later. Now he feels like he had lost everyone. Going back to the death of his mother, he was driven by this push to defeat death, to understand what animates flesh, to learn the secrets of life, but it had brought only death. Young William, pure Justine, his best friend Henry, the love of his life Elizabeth, and his own father all lay in graves. With this, he finally tells the authorities about the creature, imploring the local magistrate to help hunt it down. The magistrate listens kindly but is skeptical that any human, or supposed superhuman, could achieve what Victor describes. He considers pursuit hopeless given the creature's strength and cunning. But enraged at this dismissal, Victor decides to devote the rest of his life to hunting this creature down, vowing that either the creature will die or he himself will die in the process. He begins a relentless chase, tracking the creature northward through villages and desolate landscapes, but the creature merely revels in this chase, often leaving taunting messages and clues carved on tree bark or stone, taunting him with phrases like, "My reign is not yet over," hoping to lure Victor onward and show that the created one, the abandoned wretch, was still in control. This chase eventually leads Victor into the vast, icy wastes of the Arctic, which brings the story full circle to the point where we saw in the opening where Walton had rescued Victor. And as we exit Victor Frankenstein's first-person narrative, the story of his life, we pick back up with Walton's letters, dated August 26th, 17... Writing to Margaret, Walton confirms that he has heard the entirety of Victor's strange and terrific story, and admits it has left him awestruck and horrified. "Do you not feel your blood congeal with horror, like that which even now curdles mine?" he asks his sister. Walton briefly mentions a critical exchange between them. Intrigued by Victor's scientific achievement, he asked for details on the creature's creation. Victor reacted with alarm and fury. "Are you mad, my friend?" said he. "Would you also create for yourself and the world a demoniacal enemy? Peace, peace, learn my miseries, and do not seek to increase your own." Chastened, Walton drops the subject, and this moment highlights Victor's determination that no one repeat his fatal mistake. Walton also notes that Victor discovered him keeping a journal of the tale. Victor requested to review Walton's notes and corrected and augmented them to make sure the written account had the life and spirit of his actual conversations with the creature. "Since you have preserved my narration," Victor told him, "I would not that a mutilated one should go down to posterity." This shows Victor's lingering wish that the lessons of his story be transmitted accurately, And it is interesting that Mary Shelley herself would update this story over a decade after the original edition, from 1818 to the 1831 version. With the tale told, Walton's attention shifts to Victor's present condition. A week has passed, and Walton confides to Margaret that his thoughts and every feeling have been utterly absorbed by concern for his guest. He longs to save or console Victor, yet finds Victor's despair almost beyond reach. Can I console one so infinitely miserable? To live? Oh no. And he acknowledges that for Victor, peace may only lie in death. This ultimate tragic ending for the man who thought he had defeated death. He describes how Victor, in his delirium, finds fragile comfort in dreaming of his lost ones. A solemnity in those reveries that moves Walton's heart. Despite Victor's wretched state, Walton continues to be impressed by his intellect and character. He marvels at Victor's wide-ranging knowledge and eloquence. In their general conversations, Victor speaks with such forcible and touching rhetoric that Walton is often brought to tears. What a glorious creature must he have been in the days of his prosperity, when he is thus noble and godlike in ruin. And there were times when Victor would reflect on his past ambitions. When younger, Victor told him, I felt as if I was destined for some great enterprise. My imagination was vivid, yet my powers of analysis and application were intense. By the union of these qualities, I conceived the idea and executed the creation of a man. He spoke of hopes and a lofty ambition that had once sustained him, but now sees himself as a ruined man, chained in an eternal hell of his own making. Finally, Walton expresses his own emotional turmoil at the prospect of losing the companion he has found. Quote, must I then lose this admirable being? He asks, admitting he has longed for a friend on these desert seas, and in Victor he found one. But I fear I have gained him only to know his value and lose him. But Victor had gently rejected Walton's hope of saving him or finding new happiness. Walton relates Victor's sorrowful dismissal of any future companionship. When you speak of new ties and fresh affections, Victor told him, think you that any can replace those who are gone? I have lost everything. No one could replace Clerval or Elizabeth in Victor's heart. His grief is insurmountable. Victor asserts that only one task keeps him alive, the duty to destroy the creature, after which he expects to die, his lot on earth fulfilled. Walton ends the letter without a formal sign-off, suffused with admiration and pity for his friend on a mounting dread of what is to come. Walton's final letter, September 2nd through the 12th, 17. In what serves as the novel's epilogue, Walton's last correspondence recounts the dire developments following Victor's tale and brings the story to its conclusion. He writes to Margaret amid a crisis, quote, I write to you encompassed by peril and ignorant whether I am ever doomed to see again dear England, describing how the ship has become surrounded by mountains of ice, threatening to crush it at any moment. The crew grows disheartened and look to Walton for deliverance that he cannot promise. Despite the terrifying situation, Walton tries to maintain courage and hope, though he openly fears for his men's lives and agonizes over the thought of his sister suffering years of uncertainty if he is lost in the frozen sea. He blesses Margaret and her family, showing his heartfelt concern for her happiness even as his own prospects dim. Walton then notes that Victor Frankenstein, though gravely ill, has been behaving with spirited compassion toward Walton and the crew. Victor speaks to Walton as if life still holds value, attempting to bolster Walton's hope and morale. Quote, he reminds me how often the same accidents have appeared to other navigators. He fills me with cheerful auguries. Victor even uses his eloquence to rally the dispirited sailors. When he addresses them, they no longer despair. They believe these vast mountains of ice are molehills that human resolve can overcome. On September 5th, Walton records that a delegation of soldiers entered his cabin with an ultimatum. Trapped in the impassable ice, they demand Walton promise that if the ship is freed, he will abandon the expedition and sail south for home, rather than risk their lives further. Walton is deeply frustrated by this request. In his heart, he has not given up on reaching his goal, and the thought of turning back, ignorant and disappointed, tortures him. They had come so close, yet he knows that he cannot, in good conscience, refuse the crew's plea. He hesitates, feeling the weight of justice and his duty to his men. At that moment, Victor, who had been silently and barely conscious in Walton's quarters, summoned his remaining strength to intervene. Walton describes how Victor, quote, eyes sparkled and cheeks flushed with momentary vigor, suddenly rises and addresses the sailors in a passionate exhortation. In eloquent, fiery speech, Victor scolds the men for their cowardice. "What do you mean? What do you demand of your captain? Did you not call this a glorious expedition? Not because the way was smooth, but because it was full of danger and terror. Oh, be men, or be more than men. Be steady to your purposes and firm as a rock. Do not return to your families with the stigma of disgrace, rather as heroes who have fought and conquered." Victor's words, quote, so modulated to the different feelings and spoken with an eye, quote, full of lofty design and heroism, put the crew into awe-struck silence. The men depart to reconsider, moved by the dying man's impassioned bravery. And Walton is profoundly impressed by this scene, observing that Victor displayed the spirit of true glory one last time. After the sailors leave, though, Victor collapses from the effort, quote, sunk in languor and almost deprived of life once more. And we must remember that fateful night where Victor seemed abandoned by that spirit that possessed him, that spirit that drove him to create life. Because the way he chastises these men and encourages them on seem in contrast to his more somber, sober warnings against the pursuit of glory. As if in these final moments something possessed him to drag this new generation to their doom. And likewise, once his speech is finished, Victor's health is in the worst state yet. By September 7th, Walton's tone is resigned and sorrowful. He reports, quote, "The die is cast. I have consented to return if we are not destroyed." Confronted with the crew's safety and their unwavering demands, Walton yields. "Thus are my hopes blasted by cowardice and indecision," he writes bitterly, feeling at once both relief but overwhelmed by crushing disappointment. He confesses it takes more philosophy than I possess to accept what he sees as the injustice of this outcome. Walton had dreamed of achieving the sublime, but now must live with the label of failure. But this decision does mark a crucial turning point. He chose the lives of others over the pursuit of personal glory. Even with that last-minute rallying speech from Victor, Walton does seem to have taken heed to the moral of Victor's tale. On September 12th, Walton pens a final entry, a mix of tragic news and a wrap-up of events before the ship heads home. "It is past. I am returning to England," he begins. "I have lost my hopes of utility and glory. I have lost my friend." In the days since the decision to turn back, the ice around the ship began to break up on September 9th with thunderous noise. By the 11th, a clear passage opened south. The crew rejoiced at the prospect of deliverance, their shouts of joy waking Victor from a frail sleep. And when Victor realizes that the crew will indeed abandon the journey homeward, he is dismayed. "Do you then really return?" he asks. And Walton sorrowfully admits they must. Victor reacts passionately. "Do so, if you will, but I will not. You may give up on your purpose, but mine is assigned to me by heaven, and I dare not." Though he is too weak to stand, Victor assaults that he will not quit his own quest to destroy the creature. He attempts to raise from his bed in a last burst of resolve. His speech did not have the effect of dragging everyone else to their doom, but he had determined that he or this creature would die in this icy terrain. Declaring that nothing will stop his vengeance, but his strength fails, he collapses unconscious from this exertion. The ship's surgeon privately informs Walton that Victor will not survive more than a few hours. Walton remains by Victor's side as the end approaches, and in a quiet moment, Victor calls Walton to his bed and speaks a final, reflective monologue. In these last words, Victor is calm and sincere. He releases the fiery hatred he once held for his creature, yet still believes the creature ought to die for the good of humankind. He justifies his own actions. Quote, "In a fit of enthusiastic madness, I created a rational creature. This was my duty, but there was another still paramount. My duties toward my fellow creatures had greater claims." Victor argues that he was right to refuse to make a second monster, even if it meant forsaking his initial creation, because his responsibility to humanity outweighed his duty to his creation. He acknowledges the suffering the creature caused, the unparalleled malignity and murder of innocents, and though he no longer burns for personal revenge, he feels justified in desiring the death of his adversary, seeing it as an act of justice. Victor then turns to Walton with a last request and warning. Earlier, in selfish and vicious despair, Victor had asked Walton to kill the creature if he himself could not. But now, at the brink of death, Victor retracts any explicit burden on Walton. I cannot ask you to renounce your country and your friends to fulfill this task. I dare not ask you to do what I think right. He leaves the decision to Walter's conscience, recognizing Walton must balance his own sense of duty. Finally, Victor offers him heartfelt advice distilled from his tragic life. Quote, "Seek happiness and tranquility and avoid ambition, even if it be only the apparently innocent one of distinguishing yourself in science and discoveries." Ambition brought Victor to ruin, and he hopes Walton, who still has a chance at an ordinary, peaceful life, will heed this lesson. "Farewell, Walton," Victor says. "I have myself been blasted in these hopes, yet another may succeed." With that, Victor Frankenstein dies. Walton describes Victor's peaceful end. He passed away quietly, his eyes closed forever, while the irradiation of a gentle smile passed away from his lips. Walton is overcome with sorrow at the loss of his friend. He finds himself unable to express the depths of his sorrow, writing that, "My tears flow, my mind is overshadowed by a cloud of disappointment." And though heartbroken, Walton prepares to journey back to England, hoping to find some consolation there. But this narrative is not yet finished. There was one more disturbing event. Walton's September 12th entry continues, near midnight, as Walton writes beside Victor's coffin. He hears a sound as if of a human voice, but hoarser, coming from the cabin where Victor's body lies. He rushes to investigate, admitting he is dizzy with the remembrance of what he witnessed next. In the cabin, Walton comes upon the scene of dreadful poignancy. This creature, Frankenstein's monster himself, has boarded the ship and is standing over Victor's corpse. Walton is struck with horror at the creature's appearance, gigantic in stature yet uncouth and distorted, with a face of loathsome hideousness unlike anything Walton has seen. He notes one massive hand extended toward Victor and instinctively calls out for the creature to stay and not flee. The creature, momentarily caught by surprise, does not immediately escape. Consumed by grief, he begins to exclaim over Victor's body, "That is also my victim," he cries, lamenting that with Victor's death, the miserable series of his being is wound to its close. In an impassioned outburst, the creature addresses his dead creator. "O Frankenstein, generous and self-devoted being, what does it avail that I now ask thee to pardon me? I who irretrievably destroyed thee by destroying all thou lovest." He is racked with guilt, crying, "Alas, he is cold, he cannot answer me," weeping over the unresponsive body. And Walton notes that the creature's voice is choked with emotion. Initially, Walton's own reaction is a mix of duty and curiosity. He remembers Victor's final request, to destroy the monster, but finds himself momentarily stayed by a mixture of curiosity and compassion. Approaching the creature, Walton is at a loss of words in the face of such misery. The creature continues to pour out wild and incoherent self-reproaches, and finally Walton steels himself and addresses the creature, condemning his hypocrisy in mourning Victor after ruining his life. "Wretch," Walton calls him, "it is well that you come here to whine over the desolation that you have made. You throw a torch into a pile of buildings, and when they are consumed you sit among the ruins and lament the fall. Hypocritical fiend." Walton insists that if Victor still lived, the creature would surely still be seeking his destruction, and that the creature's remorse is hollow now that his victim is withdrawn from his power. These sharp words provoke a passionate response from the creature, who denies that Walton understands his feeling. "Oh, it is not thus, not thus." He agrees that his actions appear evil, but he rejects the notion that he seeks sympathy. "I seek not a fellow feeling in my misery," he declares. The creature then launches into a profound confession and reflection on his tragic existence. He explains that he was once filled with the love of virtue and dreamed of earning love and acceptance despite his outward form. Once my fancy was soothed with dreams of virtue, of fame, and of enjoyment, he says, recalling his innocent days observing the de Lacy family. But rejection and hatred turned his benevolent nature into bitterness. Quote, the fallen angel becomes a malignant devil, yet even that enemy of God and man had friends. I am quite alone, he proclaims. The allusion to Paradise Lost, emphasizing the depth of the creature's isolation. His fate was even worse than Satan. There were no fellow angels that he fell with. He had absolutely no companion or equal. The creature asks Walton to consider the injustice and hypocrisy of humanity. He rhetorically demands why Walton does not hate Felix for driving the creature away or the man who shot him. Even though all humankind sinned against me, I, the miserable and the abandoned, am the abortion to be spurred at and kicked and trampled on, he asserts, his blood boiling at the recollection of this injustice. Though he does fully acknowledge his crimes. I have murdered the lovely and the helpless. I have strangled the innocent as they slept, and expresses loathing for himself greater than any hatred Walton could have for him. Looking at Victor's corpse, he cries that no one can hate him as much as he hates himself. Quote, you hate me, but your abhorrence cannot equal that with which I regard myself. He is tormented by the memory of his deeds and longs for the release of death so that the frightful catalogue of his sins will haunt him no more. Importantly, the creature makes it clear that revenge did not bring him satisfaction. Quote, while I destroyed his hopes, I did not satisfy my own desires. Still I desired love and fellowship and was still spurred. Every murder was committed in a heart poisoned with remorse, and he describes the internal torture he felt even as he succumbed to vice and violence. Evil thenceforth became my good, he says of the state after losing all hope, echoing Satan's line in Paradise Lost, feeling utterly trapped that even in destroying Victor's happiness, nothing seemed to bring the creature joy or companionship. Every action only seemed to deepen his own despair. Having unburdened himself, the creature turns to his imminent end. He tells Walton that Victor's death had left him with no drive to continue living. Fear not that I shall be the instrument of future mischief, he assures Walton. My work is nearly complete, but it requires my own death. He plans to embrace his fate and commits to perform this sacrifice quickly. The creature then outlines his intended end. He will leave the ship, travel to the most northerly extremity of the globe, and there build a funerary pyre to consume to ashes this miserable frame. He notes grimly that once he is gone, the very remembrance of us both will speedily vanish, as if erasing the tragic saga from existence itself. No one will ever create such a wretch again, he says, for he will ensure that no trace of his body remains. The creature seems almost eager for the oblivion that death will bring. I shall die. I shall no longer feel the agonies which now consume me. This is my only consolation. He reflects that once, at the dawn of his life, I should have wept to die, but now it is my only consolation. Given how thoroughly polluted his mind has become by his crimes and remorse. Finally, the creature bids farewell. I leave you, and in you the last of humankind whom these eyes will ever behold. Farewell, Frankenstein. If thou wert yet alive and yet cherished a desire of revenge against me, it would be better satiated in my life than in my destruction. Blasted as thou wert, my agony was still superior to thine. Ending with a flame of dark enthusiasm, the creature proclaims that soon I shall ascend my funeral pyre triumphantly and exult in the agony of the torturing flames. My spirit will sleep in peace once this final act is complete. With that, he exclaims, farewell, one last time, and Walton watches as the creature, true to his word, leaps out of the cabin window onto the ice raft below. He was soon borne away by the waves and lost in the darkness and distance. The novel ends with this haunting image of the creature's form drifting into the Arctic night, never to be seen again.